The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a suffocating cloud of alkaline dust, the heavy wooden carriage groaning as if it shared the exhaustion of its passengers. Oakhaven was not so much a town as a desperate scar carved into the rugged frontier, a place where the timberline bled out into a vast, unforgiving ocean of prairie grass. The afternoon sun beat down with a relentless, hammering heat that seemed to bleach the color from the false front buildings and warp the wooden boardwalks. May Linnea Vance stepped down from the carriage, her boots meeting the dry earth with a soft thud that was immediately swallowed by the expansive silence of the plains. She wore a traveling dress of dark navy wool, practical and entirely too warm for the season, its hem already collecting the pale dust of her new reality. She carried a single leather valise, its surface scarred by years of transit, holding everything she owned in the world. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin held high, a physical manifestation of the dignity she wrapped around herself like armor. She was a woman of mixed heritage, her features a striking blend of the East and the West, a reality that had always made her an outsider in polite society. She had come to Oakhaven on a promise, a written contract of marriage and partnership with a man named Elias Reed, who had sworn to meet her at the depot with the funds she had sent ahead to secure their future. The depot platform was largely empty, save for the station master who was busy unloading crates of dry goods with a slow, methodical disinterest. May stood by the ticket window for an hour, the sun inching lower in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dirt road. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and distant pine, whistling through the gaps in the wooden siding of the station. She did not allow herself to pace, nor did she allow the creeping cold of panic to show on her face. She merely stood, her hands folded neatly over the handle of her valise, watching the road. When the station master finally locked the ticket window, he paused, wiping his brow with a soiled kerchief, and cast a weary glance in her direction. He informed her, with the blunt cruelty of a man who had seen too many broken promises on the frontier, that Elias Reed had boarded a northbound train 3 days prior, accompanied by a woman of ill repute and a surprisingly heavy lockbox. The words hit May like a physical blow, a cold shock that radiated from her chest outward, freezing the blood in her veins. All her careful planning, the years spent saving every penny from her work as a bookkeeper and seamstress in the eastern cities, the leap of faith she had taken to cross half the country, it had all been a hollow lie. She was stranded at the edge of the civilized world, her pockets entirely empty, her reputation tethered to a ghost. With no other options, May made her way down the main thoroughfare of Oakhaven, her steps measured and deliberate despite the crushing weight of her circumstances. She sought out the largest establishment in town, the Oakhaven Mercantile and Bank, a 2-story structure of freshly painted white pine that dominated the street. Inside, the air was cool and smelled sharply of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, and peppermint sticks. Behind the polished mahogany counter stood Thaddeus Sterling, a man whose superficial respectability was worn as carefully as his tailored broadcloth suit. Sterling was the pillar of Oakhaven, the merchant who held the notes on half the ranches in the valley, a man who built his fortune on the desperate margins of other people's lives. May approached the counter, laying out her situation with precise, unsentimental language. She did not ask for charity. She asked for a small line of credit, offering her skills as a master bookkeeper and seamstress as collateral until she could secure steady employment. She spoke clearly, her dark eyes fixed on Sterling's pale, calculating face, refusing to let her voice tremble. Thaddeus Sterling listened with a small, patronizing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He steepled his fingers, his gaze sweeping over her with a leisurely, invasive scrutiny that made her skin crawl. He noted the dust on her dress, the tight grip she had on her valise, and the undeniable fact of her heritage. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, carrying loudly enough for the other patrons in the store to hear. He expressed a deep theatrical sorrow for her plight, but declared that the bank could not extend credit to a woman of unknown origins and questionable associations. He suggested with a venomous sweetness that a woman abandoned by her betrothed might find more suitable, if less savory ways to earn her keep in a town full of lonely men. The implication hung in the air, heavy and vile. The ambient noise of the mercantile ceased entirely. The townspeople, the gossiping wives, and the loitering ranch hands turned their eyes toward her, their faces masks of judgment and morbid curiosity. May felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a fierce, burning humiliation that threatened to break her composure, but she did not weep, and she did not flee. She simply picked up her valise, gave Sterling a look of profound, icy contempt, and walked out of the store into the fading afternoon light, completely alone and entirely without refuge. From the deep shadows of the livery awning across the street, Silas Thorne watched the scene unfold. Silas was a man sculpted by the harshness of the land he worked, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by wind and grief. He wore a faded canvas duster and a Stetson pulled low over his eyes, obscuring the hard, flinty gray of his gaze. 5 years ago, Silas had buried his wife beneath a solitary oak on the ridge of his property, the Blackwood Ranch. Since that day, he had built high, impenetrable fences around his life, both literal and metaphorical. He came to town only for supplies, speaking in low, gravelly monosyllables, avoiding the social machinations of Oakhaven with a quiet, intimidating finality. Before he was a rancher, in a life that felt like it belonged to another man, he had made his living with the heavy Colt revolver that still rested comfortably at his hip. The town knew enough of his history to leave him be. He was a respected man, but a solitary one, an island of quiet integrity in a sea of frontier opportunism. Silas had seen the stagecoach arrive, had noted the solitary woman standing on the platform, and had watched her steady, dignified walk to the mercantile. He had heard the cruel, carrying resonance of Thaddeus Sterling's voice through the open doors of the shop. Silas despised Sterling. He knew the merchant for what he was, a predator who hid behind ledger books and legal statutes, a coward who crushed the vulnerable while smiling. As May stepped back out onto the boardwalk, her shoulders rigid, her head unbowed despite the terrible weight of her situation, something stirred in the dormant, ash-covered hearth of Silas's chest. It was not pity. Pity was a useless emotion on the plains. It was a profound, quiet recognition of a kindred spirit, a fellow soul standing firm against a bitter wind. He watched her pause at the edge of the boardwalk, looking down the dusty street that offered no shelter, no welcome, and no future. Silas stepped out from the shadows, his spurs ringing with a dull, rhythmic clink against the hard-packed earth. He crossed the street with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. The murmurs of the townspeople died down as he approached. Oakhaven knew better than to interfere when Silas Thorne moved with purpose. He stopped a few paces from May, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of simple, unadorned respect. He did not offer empty condolences or pry into the humiliation she had just suffered. He looked at her directly, noting the intelligence and the fierce banked fire in her dark eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was a deep, gravelly rumble, quiet but carrying absolute authority. He stated a fact. He told her that his foreman had quit the week prior, that his ranch ledgers were a tangled mess, and that his house had not seen a proper cleaning since the winter thaw. The offer was framed with a blunt, transactional clarity that honored her dignity. He needed a bookkeeper and someone to manage the homestead. He offered a fair wage, a dry room, and 3 meals a day. It was not charity, it was an exchange of value. May looked at the tall, imposing man before her. She saw the heavy revolver at his hip, the calloused roughness of his hands, and the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. She also saw the absence of the predatory calculation that had tainted Thaddeus Sterling's gaze. This man was offering her a lifeline, a rope that she could use to pull herself out of the dust. She calculated her options, which were entirely non-existent, and made her decision with the swift, practical logic that had kept her alive thus far. She nodded, her voice crisp and steady as she accepted the terms, demanding only that she be given a small advance to purchase necessary supplies for her work. Silas agreed without hesitation, pulling a heavy silver dollar from his pocket and handing it to her. The transaction was complete, a sudden, unexpected pivot in the trajectory of both their lives. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch took 2 hours, the buckboard wagon rattling over rutted trails that wound upward toward the foothills. The silence between them was expansive, filling the space on the wooden seat, but it was not the strained, awkward silence of strangers forced together. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of 2 people who understood that words were precious and not to be wasted on idle chatter. The landscape shifted from the flat, dusty prairie to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and stands of dark pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the high country. May sat rigidly upright, her eyes taking in every detail of the land, memorizing the contours of her new sanctuary. Silas drove the team with a relaxed, expert ease, his hands resting lightly on the leather reins. He occasionally pointed out a landmark, a dry creek bed, a distant ridge, but otherwise left her to her thoughts. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the coiled energy of a woman who had just survived a disaster and was bracing for the next. When they finally crested the last rise, the Blackwood Ranch lay spread out before them in the golden light of the late afternoon. It was a substantial property, far larger than May had anticipated. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone, flanked by a massive barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse. But despite its size, the neglect was evident. The fences were sagging in places, the porch steps were warped, and a thick layer of dust coated the windows. It was the home of a man who worked the land but had forgotten how to live in it. Silas brought the wagon to a halt near the porch and helped her down, his large hand surprisingly gentle as it supported her elbow. He showed her to a small, sparse room off the kitchen, containing a narrow iron bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair. It was Spartan, but it was clean, and it had a solid door with a stout lock. For the first time since she had realized Elias Reed's betrayal, May felt the tight band of panic around her chest begin to loosen. She had a place to stand. The next morning, May began her work with the relentless efficiency of a soldier executing a campaign. She rose before the sun, kindling the fire in the massive cast-iron stove, and brewing a pot of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. When Silas emerged from his quarters, expecting the usual cold silence of the house, he was greeted by the smell of roasting oats, sizzling bacon, and the sight of a woman already deep into the task of reclaiming his home from decay. She did not wait for instructions. She served him breakfast with a quiet nod, then immediately turned her attention to the small study where Silas kept his business affairs. The desk was a chaotic mountain of receipts, banknotes, and half-filled ledgers. May tackled it with a methodical, ruthless precision. She spent 3 days doing nothing but sorting, calculating, and documenting, her pen scratching across the parchment in a continuous, rhythmic whisper. She worked late into the night by the light of a kerosene lamp, unraveling the tangled threads of the Blackwood Ranch's finances. Silas watched this transformation with a growing sense of awe, though his face remained entirely impassive. He was a man who understood the value of hard work, but he had never seen anyone apply such fierce, intellectual rigor to a task. By the end of her first week, May presented him with a perfectly balanced set of ledgers. She sat across from him at the heavy oak dining table, her posture perfect, and explained the financial health of his ranch with clear, concise authority. She pointed out areas where he was losing money on feed, discrepancies in the shipping costs of his cattle, and most alarmingly, a series of irregular interest charges on a loan he held with the Oak Haven Bank. Her finger, slender and ink-stained, tapped against the column of numbers. She did not accuse, but she laid out the facts with undeniable clarity. Thaddeus Sterling had been quietly skimming money from the Blackwood accounts for over 2 years, hiding the theft behind complex, compounding interest rates that Silas's former foreman had never bothered to check. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Silas stared at the numbers, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his neck standing out like corded steel. The quiet, solitary peace he had built was a facade. He was being bled dry by the very town he avoided. He looked up from the ledger, his gray eyes meeting May's dark, steady gaze. He saw no fear in her, only the calm, practical expectation of a problem that needed to be solved. In that moment, the fundamental nature of their arrangement shifted. She was no longer just a hired hand. She was an ally, a partner who had armed him with the truth. He closed the ledger with a soft thud, the sound echoing in the quiet house. He did not fly into a rage. He simply nodded, his voice dangerously soft as he thanked her for her diligence. He told her to keep the books locked away. The storm was coming, and they both knew it. Over the next month, the dynamic between Silas and May settled into a rhythm of quiet, profound respect. The house, once a tomb of memory and dust, began to breathe again. May mended the torn curtains, scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, and planted a small kitchen garden near the back porch. She learned the names of the ranch hands, treating them with a formal, distant courtesy that quickly earned their grudging respect. She was not a woman to be trifled with, and the men knew better than to cross the boss's new bookkeeper. Silas, in turn, found himself lingering in the kitchen after dinner, nursing a cup of coffee just to listen to the soft rustle of her skirts or the scratching of her pen. They rarely spoke of personal matters. Their conversations were strictly confined to the business of the ranch, the price of beef, the mending of fences, the approaching winter. But in the spaces between their words, a deep, unspoken bond was forging. He noticed the way the morning light caught the dark sheen of her hair. She noticed the way his shoulders relaxed when he sat by the fire. It was a slow-burn recognition of mutual competence and shared, quiet dignity. However, the peace of the Blackwood Ranch was an illusion, a fragile bubble waiting to be burst by the malicious intent of Thaddeus Sterling. Sterling was a man who kept a close eye on his investments, and the sudden, sharp decrease in the surplus funds flowing from the Blackwood accounts did not go unnoticed. He made inquiries in town, listening to the idle gossip of the ranch hands who came in for supplies. He learned about the foreign woman Silas Thorne had taken in, the bookkeeper who had turned the ranch upside down. Sterling was a predator, and he recognized the scent of a threat. He knew that if his fraudulent accounting was exposed, his reputation and his empire in Oak Haven would crumble. He decided to act before Silas could bring the matter to the authorities. He would use the very prejudices of the town to break them. On a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky bruised purple with the threat of a dry thunderstorm, Thaddeus Sterling rode out to the Blackwood Ranch. He did not come alone. He was accompanied by 2 men, rough-hewn enforcers he kept on his payroll to intimidate stubborn debtors. They rode into the yard with an arrogant swagger, their horses kicking up dust that drifted over May's newly planted garden. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting casually near the butt of his Colt, his face an impenetrable mask of cold stone. May stood just inside the screen door, hidden in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her mind racing with cold calculation. Sterling dismounted, slapping the dust from his pristine coat, and approached the porch with a broad, entirely false smile. He greeted Silas with oily familiarity, commenting on the dry weather and the state of the cattle. Silas did not return the greeting. He merely stared, waiting for the merchant to reveal his hand. Sterling's smile faltered slightly under the weight of Silas's stare. He cleared his throat and shifted his tactics, his voice taking on a tone of unctuous, fatherly concern. He stated that there were rumors in town, ugly whispers about the nature of Silas's living arrangement with the unmarried woman. He suggested, with heavy theatrical regret, that such a scandal could damage Silas's standing, perhaps even prompt the bank to call in the note on the western pasture due to a breach of the moral turpitude clause in the loan contract. It was a transparent, clumsy threat, an attempt to use social pressure and legal trickery to force Silas into submission. Sterling offered a solution: dismiss the woman, hand over the recent ledgers for a standard audit, and the bank would overlook the indiscretion. He smiled again, a terrible predatory baring of teeth. Silas did not move. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Sterling with a disgust so profound it seemed to lower the temperature on the porch. He told Sterling, in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, that his ledgers were none of the bank's concern, that the note on the western pasture was paid current, and that if Sterling or his men ever set foot on Blackwood land again, they would not leave it breathing. The threat was not a boast. It was a simple, absolute statement of fact, backed by the deadly reputation of a man who had survived a violent past. Sterling's face flushed a mottled, ugly red. He was not used to being spoken to with such blatant disregard. His hired men shifted uneasily, their hands drifting toward their belts, but Silas's gaze flicked to them, freezing them in place. Sterling spat a curse into the dirt, turned on his heel, and mounted his horse. As they rode away, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of ozone and dry earth. The battle lines were drawn. The escalation came 3 nights later. The dry thunderstorm that had been threatening the valley finally broke, but it brought no rain, only jagged forks of lightning that tore across the black sky, illuminating the rolling plains in stark, blinding flashes. The wind howled around the eaves of the main house, a relentless, shrieking force that rattled the window panes. May was awake, sitting at the small desk in her room, unable to sleep. She was reviewing the ledgers again, memorizing the exact dates and amounts of Sterling's thefts, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the bunkhouse, followed by the frantic, terrifying whinny of a panicked horse. May rushed to the window. In the distance, near the main barn where the dry winter hay was stored, a small, unnatural bloom of orange light was growing rapidly, feeding greedily on the wind. Fire. May did not scream, she did not freeze. She grabbed her heavy woolen shawl, shoved her feet into her boots, and sprinted out the back door into the howling wind. Silas was already ahead of her, a dark silhouette running toward the flames, shouting orders to the groggy ranch hands tumbling out of the bunkhouse. It was not a lightning strike. The fire had started on the leeward side of the barn, near a stack of oiled tarpaulins. It was deliberate. It was Sterling's men. The heat was immense, a physical wall that pushed back against them as they approached. The flames were licking up the wooden siding, reaching for the dry loft above. The horses inside were screaming, a horrific, high-pitched sound of pure terror that cut through the roar of the fire. Silas grabbed a heavy axe from the chopping block and began hacking at the burning siding, trying to create a firebreak, while the men formed a desperate, chaotic bucket line from the water trough. May saw immediately that the bucket line was too slow, the wind too fierce. The barn was going to burn, and the horses would die inside. Without waiting for instruction, she ran to the heavy wooden doors of the barn. The iron latch was searing hot. She wrapped her shawl around her hands, ignoring the blistering pain, and threw her entire weight against the lever. The doors groaned and gave way, swinging open to reveal a hellscape of smoke and panicked, thrashing animals. May plunged into the smoke. She could not see, her eyes watering, her lungs burning with every drawn breath. She relied on memory and touch, feeling her way along the wooden stalls. She found the first horse, a massive roan gelding, rearing and kicking at the stall door. She spoke to it in a low, commanding voice, a tone she had learned from watching Silas, projecting a calm she did not feel. She managed to slip a lead rope over its halter, blindfolding the animal with a torn strip of her petticoat, and dragged it out into the chaotic yard. She handed the rope to a stunned ranch hand and turned back. She went in a second time, and a third. On her fourth trip, the roof of the barn gave an ominous, terrifying groan. A burning timber fell from the loft, crashing into the aisle just feet away from her, sending up a shower of sparks that singed her hair and caught the hem of her dress. Silas saw the timber fall. He dropped his axe, his heart stopping in his chest. He roared her name, a sound of raw, unadulterated terror that tore from his throat and charged into the burning structure. He found her struggling to lead the last horse, a young, terrified filly, around the burning debris. He grabbed the horse's halter with one hand, wrapping his other massive arm around May's waist, practically lifting her off her feet as he dragged them both out through the heavy smoke, just as the main loft collapsed in a spectacular roaring shower of embers. They collapsed onto the hard dirt of the yard, coughing violently, gasping for the cool, clean night air. The ranch hands managed to contain the fire to the barn, preventing it from spreading to the house, but the structure was entirely lost, a glowing skeletal ruin against the dark sky. In the immediate aftermath, the yard was chaotic with the shouting of men and the stamping of nervous horses. Silas waved the men away, ordering them to secure the animals in the outer corrals. He turned to May, who was sitting on the ground, her face streaked with black soot, her dress scorched and ruined. She was trembling violently, the adrenaline leaving her body in a sudden crashing wave. Silas dropped to his knees beside her. He reached out, his large calloused hands trembling slightly, and gently took her arm. He saw the angry red burn across her forearm, where the hot iron latch had seared her skin. The sight of her injury, the realization of how close he had come to losing her in the flames, broke something open inside him. The high, impenetrable fences he had built around his heart shattered. "You foolish, brave woman," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, lacking its usual gravelly reserve. He pulled a clean kerchief from his pocket, pouring water from his canteen over it, and began to carefully bind her burn. The touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. May looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his. The space between them, usually filled with professional distance and unspoken respect, was suddenly intimate, charged with a profound, terrifying vulnerability. She did not pull away. She let him tend to her, feeling the solid, comforting heat of his presence. "They tried to take it," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "They tried to take your home." Silas tied off the bandage, his hands lingering on her wrist. "It's not just my home anymore, May, not since you arrived." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded like a vow in the quiet, smoky air. He looked away, staring at the glowing embers of the barn. 5 years ago, I lost my wife to a fever. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. I just had to watch. I swore I would never care for anything again, never let anything close enough to hurt me when it was taken away. I built this ranch into a fortress, but a fortress is just a tomb if you're the only one inside." He looked back at her, his gray eyes shining with an unshed sorrow. "When I saw that roof come down, I felt the fever again. I felt the end of the world." May felt a tear cut a clean track through the soot on her cheek. She reached out with her uninjured hand, her fingers lightly touching the rough stubble on his jaw. "I have spent my entire life being told I do not belong," she confessed, her voice trembling but clear. "My mother's people rejected me. My father's people looked through me. Elias Reed used me and threw me away. I came here with nothing but my pride and a valise. But you looked at me and saw a person. You gave me a place to stand." She paused, her thumb brushing against his cheekbone. "They will not burn us out, Silas. We have the ledgers. We have the truth. We will fight them." The dawn broke over the Blackwood Ranch, painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and gold. The air smelled of wet ash and scorched earth. Silas and May did not sleep. They washed the soot from their faces, dressed in their cleanest clothes, and saddled 2 horses. May packed the leather-bound ledgers into her saddlebag, the heavy weight of the paper a physical comfort against her leg. They rode down the mountain toward Oakhaven, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a bridge of shared purpose and absolute resolve. They were not riding to town to seek justice, they were riding to demand it. Oakhaven was just waking up when they rode down the main street. The air was crisp, the dust settled by the night's high winds. Silas rode with his head high, his duster swept back to clearly reveal the heavy colt at his hip. May rode beside him, her posture perfectly erect, her chin held at that familiar defiant angle. They did not stop at the sheriff's office. They rode straight to the Oakhaven Mercantile. Silas dismounted, tied his horse to the rail, and offered his hand to May. She took it, stepping down gracefully. Together they walked up the wooden steps and pushed through the double doors of the Mercantile. The store was moderately busy, the early morning crowd gathering for coffee and gossip. Thaddeus Sterling was standing behind his mahogany counter, looking remarkably fresh and composed. When he saw Silas and May enter, his smile froze, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his pale eyes. He had expected news of a devastating fire, perhaps a broken, ruined rancher begging for an extension on his note. He had not expected them to walk through his doors with cold, righteous fury radiating from them. The ambient chatter in the store died instantly. The townspeople backed away, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Silas walked to the counter, his boots loud on the floorboards. He did not say a word. He simply stopped, resting his hands on the polished wood, and stared at Sterling. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Sterling began to sweat, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. He tried to speak, to offer a placating greeting, but his voice failed him. May stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Silas. She unbuckled her saddlebag, pulled out the heavy ledger, and slammed it down onto the counter with a crack that made the townsfolk jump. "Mr. Sterling," May began, her voice ringing out clear and precise, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I have spent the last month conducting a thorough audit of the Blackwood Ranch accounts. I have found an alarming pattern of discrepancies." She opened the ledger, flipping to a marked page, and spun the book around to face the merchant. "Over the past 2 years, you have systematically overcharged interest, invented phantom fees, and directly diverted funds from the Blackwood accounts to your own personal ledgers. The total theft amounts to over $3,000. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Theft was a hanging offense on the frontier, and stealing from a man like Silas Thorne was considered suicidal. Sterling's face turned the color of spoiled milk. He sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at May. "This is an outrage! This foreign woman is a liar! She has fabricated these numbers to ruin me!" He looked around the room, desperately seeking support from the townspeople who usually hung on his every word. "You all know me! I am a pillar of this community!" "You are a thief and a coward," Silas said, his voice low, cutting through Sterling's panic like a blade. "And an arsonist. Your men burned my barn last night. They nearly killed my horses. They nearly killed her." Silas leaned over the counter, invading Sterling's space, the sheer physical menace of the man overwhelming the merchant. "I am not here to negotiate, Sterling. I am here to collect. You will draw up a draft for the stolen funds. You will cancel the note on my western pasture. And you will pack your bags and be on the noon stagecoach out of Oakhaven. If you are still in this town when the sun goes down, I will not bother with the sheriff." Sterling looked at the ledger, then at the cold, murderous intent in Silas's eyes, and finally at the faces of the townspeople. He saw no sympathy, only shock and growing anger. The town of Oakhaven might have been prejudiced, but they respected hard work and despised a cheat. The illusion of Thaddeus Sterling's respectability was shattered, broken by the meticulous arithmetic of a woman they had deemed unworthy. Sterling collapsed into his chair, a broken, ruined man. With shaking hands, he reached for his pen and began to write the drafts, signing away his power and his place in the town. Silas and May did not linger to watch his humiliation. They took the drafts, secured the ledger, and walked out of the mercantile into the bright morning sunlight. The townspeople parted for them, their eyes lowered in newfound respect. They mounted their horses and rode back toward the mountains. The ride home was different. The heavy burden of the impending threat was gone, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-tinged peace. They had fought the dragon and won, not with bullets, but with truth and unity. When they reached the Blackwood Ranch, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long golden shadows across the yard. The ruins of the barn were still smoldering, a stark reminder of the previous night, but the air felt lighter, cleansed. Silas unsaddled the horses, turning them out into the pasture while May went into the house to start a fire in the stove. When Silas finally came inside, the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. May was standing by the window looking out at the mountains, her silhouette framed by the fading light. Silas walked up behind her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, but he did not touch her. He took off his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. He was a man of few words, and the words he needed now felt immense, heavy with the weight of the rest of his life. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet kitchen. "May," he started, his voice steady but carrying a deep, resonant earnestness. She turned to face him, her dark eyes looking up into his. "I am a plain man. I don't have a poet's tongue. I have a ruined barn, a lot of hard work ahead, and a past that is heavy to carry." He stopped turning the hat, his large hands gripping the brim tightly. "But I also have a home, and for the first time in 5 years, it feels alive. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life." He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "I don't want a bookkeeper anymore. I don't want an arrangement. I want a partner. I want a wife." He looked at her, his grey eyes entirely open, completely vulnerable. "I am asking you to stay, May Linnea Vance. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you belong, because I love you, and I cannot imagine this land, or my life, without you in it." The proposal was not flowery or desperate. It was a plain-spoken, heartfelt declaration of fact, built on the solid foundation of the respect and trust they had forged in the crucible of the past month. May looked at the tall, strong man standing before her. She saw the lines of hardship on his face, the quiet honor in his eyes, and the deep abiding safety he offered. She thought of the long, lonely years she had spent searching for a place to anchor herself, the bitter betrayal that had brought her to this dusty town, and the unexpected, magnificent partnership she had found in the ashes. A slow, beautiful smile broke across her face, reaching her eyes and illuminating her features. She reached out, taking the hat from his hands and setting it on the table. She placed her hands flat against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath the canvas duster. "I accept your terms, Silas Thorne," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears of pure joy. "I will stay. I will be your partner. I will be your wife." Silas let out a breath that sounded like a ragged sigh of relief. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him, burying his face in the dark, smoky scent of her hair. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, two solitary souls who had found their refuge in each other, the silence around them no longer a barrier, but a shared, comfortable blanket. A year passed on the frontier, a turning of seasons that brought profound change to the Blackwood Ranch. The winter had been harsh, burying the valley in deep, silent drifts of snow, but the house had remained warm, filled with the steady, quiet contentment of their new life together. When the spring thaw came, the ranch exploded into activity. The money recovered from Sterling had been put to good use. A new barn, larger and sturdier than the last, now stood in the yard, its fresh pine boards gleaming in the sun. The fences were mended, the cattle were fat, and the ledgers, meticulously maintained by May, showed a prosperity the ranch had never known. The town of Oakhaven had changed as well. With Thaddeus Sterling gone, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of debt and fear had lifted. The townspeople, chastened by the events at the Mercantile, had slowly, cautiously extended an olive branch. When Silas and May rode into town for supplies, they were no longer met with whispers and stares, but with respectful nods and polite greetings. Cora Higgins, the owner of the boarding house who had always harbored a secret dislike for Sterling, had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, bringing jars of preserves and trading recipes with May. The town had learned, through the undeniable proof of her competence and character, that May Thorne was a woman to be respected, a true partner to the formidable Silas. It was late autumn, the air crisp and smelling of wood smoke and turning leaves. The sun was dipping low over the western ridge, casting a warm golden light across the porch of the Blackwood homestead. Silas sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair, his boots propped up on the railing, a cup of coffee resting on his knee. He was watching a young foal, born just weeks prior, capering clumsily in the near corral. The lines of grief that had once defined his face had softened, replaced by the quiet, settled look of a man who was entirely at peace with his world. The screen door creaked open, and May stepped out onto the porch. She wore a simple dress of faded blue cotton, an apron tied around her waist, her hands dusted with flour from the bread she was baking. She carried a second cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool evening air. She walked over to Silas, handing him the cup, and leaned against the sturdy wooden railing beside him. He reached out, his large hand wrapping comfortably around her waist, pulling her close against his side. She rested her hand on his shoulder, her fingers absently tracing the heavy fabric of his shirt. They stood together in silence, watching the fading light paint the mountains in shades of violet and bruised orange. It was not the tense, expansive silence of their first journey together, nor the heavy, grief-laden silence of the night the barn burned. It was a comfortable, profound silence, the kind that only exists between two people who know each other completely, who have faced the fire and emerged stronger. May looked out over the thriving garden, the new barn, the solid, unyielding strength of the man beside her. She thought of the dusty, desolate stagecoach platform, the crushing weight of betrayal, and the desperate, terrifying leap of faith she had taken when a solitary stranger had offered her a job. "The books are balanced for the month," she said softly, breaking the silence with the comfortable rhythm of their shared life. "We have enough surplus to buy that new breeding bull from the eastern herd before the snow flies." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at her. "You always were a masterful bookkeeper, Mrs. Thorne." May smiled, a quiet, satisfied expression. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid, rhythmic beat of his heart, the anchor that held her steady in the vastness of the plains. The wind whispered through the scrub oak, carrying the chill of the coming winter, but on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch there was only warmth, earned trust, and a lasting, unbreakable peace. The frontier was still wild, still unforgiving, but they faced it together, masters of their own domain, their future secured by the quiet strength of their partnership. The dark days were behind them, buried in the ashes of the past, and the golden light of the evening promised a long, bright tomorrow.